everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I appreciate that you enjoyed the intro song. It's a great one. So I am Allison O'Connor. I am with CSU Extension in Larimer County, and we're thrilled that you're here today to learn more about fruit tree production. My co-pilot is Cassie Anderson from Adams County, and we will be on the back end answering all of the questions that you have. And our presenter today is Dr. Jeff Pieper, who I will introduce in just 1 second. CSU is an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. If there's anything we can do to accommodate your needs, please let us know and visit the website for more information. A couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted to planttalk.org, and Cassie will put that link into the chat, so not only can you catch pre-recorded webinars that we've already done, but you can also sign up for ones that we have in the future. If you do have questions today, please open up the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen and enter your questions there. If we can't answer them, we will toss them to Jeff, who will hopefully have time at the end. And this is a monthly series that we do. So on the second Wednesday of each month at noon Mountain Time, we do these webinars. Next month, we have Mel Schreiner, also from the Western Slope, who will be joining us for myths, mistakes, and misunderstood insects. Whew, that's a lot of M's. And Mel will talk about just things that you may be curious about or that may be misinformed about some of our insect friends. So check that out, register for that. We would love to have you. And without further ado, I am going to introduce to you Jeff Pieper, who is the Horticulture and Natural Resources Specialist in the Tri-River area. And he just finished his PhD in fruit tree production looking at peaches. So congratulations to you, Jeff. We know the haul that it takes to do that. We appreciate you being a resource for us and learning more about the basics of fruit trees. So take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Al. Hopefully I can just at least debunk one of the things from the song there. Peaches are not from a can. They clearly grow on trees, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And we are going to start with a bit of background information on tree fruit production, but it is going to be a bit focused on peach, but I'll talk about cherry and apple as well. So hopefully, as Allison said, this will cover a lot of your questions, and we'll do a little bit of moving back and forth between backyard production and kind of commercial production, so you can kind of understand the entire system. As Al was saying, my name is Dr. Jeff Pieper, and I came from Fort Collins. Actually, I was not born in Fort Collins, but basically I moved there when I was 4 years old. So anyways, I made my way over to the Western Slope over time and found my way into Dr. Giannis Minas's program, where we looked at the pre-harvest factors on peach production. So anything that's being done to the trees or the orchard before harvest and how that affects fruit quality going forward. So for CSU on the Western Slope, this is kind of a hub for tree fruit production in Colorado, as many of you probably know. It's also a hub for wine grapes. So we have quite a large crew that is working, both research scientists and research associates who are working on tree fruit problems, research questions and ideas over here on the Western Slope. And it's part of the Agricultural Experiment Station system, which CSU has many across the state. In the Grand Junction area, the Greater Western Colorado Research Center, we have 3 research stations, so we're kind of blessed out here. One is called Orchard Mesa, that primarily focuses on tree fruit and viticulture or wine production. We also have Rogers Mesa, which is in Hotchkiss, which is a certified organic station that also does a lot of grapes and or tree fruit production. And there's also Fruta, which we have more row crops and or water questions and water use and utility. So here's kind of just a general overview of what I hope to cover today. So it's all going to be kind of production oriented hopefully refresher or education series. So I'm going to start with climatic factors, and then we'll move to tree components and selection, fruit quality, pruning and thinning, some common issues, and some great resources that we have. So as I talked about before, we'll be looking at primarily peach, apple, and cherry, but I probably can address some few questions as well if we have some on prunes or apricots, maybe pears. Some people are trying to grow. Um, so yeah, let's get started with these climatic factors. As many the participants probably know, Grand Junction is known as one of the warmest places in Colorado, and which is why we have the thriving tree fruit industry of the state. So you can see here in the USDA plant hardiness zone map that Grand Junction is the warmest kind of agricultural area. Now, there's a lot of things that come into play when it comes to ag production. You not only have to have the climate, but you have to have a good place to grow and also water, which Grand Junction has all three of those, fortunately. So one of the things that we have, obviously, is our mesas, which a lot of the fruit production is concentrated on. So why do I spend so much time talking about this? Well, when it comes to tree fruit production, it's really very important. And that's due to this type of slide, which is very kind of confusing. But let's go through it together and we can talk about why and how Grand Junction is the best place for fruit production. But also, this relates to some of the challenges you might be seeing at home. Okay, so if you just move along to the bottom and you can see the seasonality of the tree fruit cycle or growing season, and I want to focus on kind of the bottom half of that graph, where it says dormancy. So if we move to fall and we go up, you can see that the trees are in dormancy and beginning their endodormancy or winter rest. And there's a couple things here that are challenging, right? So one would be it's right in that little section at the bottom of the curve there. And it says endodormancy or winter rest. So we're looking at temperatures from, you know, various different ranges, but it can depend on your climatic factors there. And you see that like -6 to -18 Fahrenheit can have some real detrimental effects on trees. So you can start to have the trees freeze, you can start to have complete tree death. And some of our fruit trees, especially peaches, are susceptible to really cold climates. And that's why peach production on the Front Range isn't really viable as an industry. And we can talk about that more going forward. But then as we're coming out of winter and we're going into spring, our other challenge is frost, obviously. And our growers here, we've already passed full bloom. It's one of the earliest blooms on record, about 3 weeks before average. And we're still concerned with frost. We had a couple years ago still a frost through kind of Mother's Day. So again, we're kind of focused on this whole endodormancy idea when it comes to front range fruit production. And then we're looking at this ecodormancy and deacclimation and what that means to your blooms, which will become your fruit going forward. So, there's a lot of different ways that you can lose your fruit crop or damage your trees. And for us, one of the biggest concerns is these inversion draws. So with an inversion, and like I said, with Grand Junction, you have a lot of different topography changes across the area. So you have the river bottom, and then you have a lot of different mesas, and that creates cold air drainage pockets. And so in an inversion, typically you have a really cold, calm night. And so all your heat starts to be lost out to the atmosphere with no clouds. And that cold air will come down and settle in the bottoms. And so this can be a real challenge to our growers. Moving that cold air is a great way to kind of disrupt some of this inversion patterns. And it's one of the few ways that we can augment our temperatures in the winter. However, there are some challenges with that. But also, you can see on kind of the right side of this figure here that planting on some of those uh, higher topographies can also alleviate some of those cold air drainage and settling issues. So if you're familiar with the Grand Junction area, just kind of to the south of Palisade is the East Orchard Mesa. And that mesa is, elevated quite a bit above the river bottom, creating quite a bit of frost protection for some of the growers. The super challenge for us, which has been rare and becoming more rare over the course of the winter, is when we have this snow layer. And the snow layer kind of prevents some of that radiative frost, radiative temperatures from coming up from the ground. It creates kind of a blanket and doesn't allow some of the warm temperatures from the ground to come up, and creates an even more dangerous situation. This scenario really was a challenge for our growers on this date in Orchard Mesa. So obviously, winter low temperatures, either that be like the low temperature of the year in midwinter, or these spring frosts are a major issue for Colorado growers. And again, kind of why we focus most of our fruit production on the western slope. Here is something that I'll get more into going forward, but this is something that people are often confused and find it challenging to determine if their tree fruit or floral tissues are alive or dead. And so here is just a really simple thing you can do with like a straight edge or a razor blade. You can go out, cut some fruiting twigs off of your trees, and you can dissect the blossoms. And so after a frost, I would recommend, going out to your fruit tree, pruning a few limbs, putting them on your counter inside the house, and letting them warm up for about 24 hours. And that creates an opportunity for oxidative browning. And so we can see here on the bottom picture, that is kind of the floral parts being developed inside the bud. And on the right, you can see that the buds are really nice and green. Sorry, on the left, they're really nice and green. And on the right, they will turn brown. So the oxidative browning will show you that you no longer have your fruit. So some other examples of frost. Here is an apple tree. You can see the frosting on the tips and the petals. And if you look more closely, you can look at the ovary of the fruit. This time, we have actually cut the blossoms in half. And you can see, again, that green tissue suggesting live fruit and the dead tissue turning brown. It also shows up in cherries. Cherries might be one of the easiest ones to look at, and you can see this on the tree quite easily. Here, you can see the razor blade in the bottom of the picture, but you are able just to, rip the floral tissues, petals apart, and look at that ovary to see if it is still viable. And again, the green tissue, really nice, it's still developing fruit. And that black ovary is been fried in the frost. Also, the same thing happens in apricots. So one thing that you can see, if you start on the live picture, but you can see the one behind the live one, so it's really small and kind of shriveled. And you can see that kind of translating over to the dead ones, where the pit is kind of pulling away from the mesocarp there, and it's becoming quite shriveled on the far right, a good sign that you've lost your fruit due to frost. And so each different stage, and maybe some of you have seen this, maybe some of you have not, but each different stage of development correlates with a specific temperature of death, essentially. So we have created these charts that look at floral bud tissue based on developmental stage. And you can see that there's a percentage of kill or likelihood of death by temperature. So if you start with the swollen bud at first swell, you can see the 10% kill temperature is 18 degrees, whereas the 90% kill temperature is 1 degree. And you can follow that through all the way through bud development into flowering, and then looking at post bloom. and a shuck split where you have a fruit lip developing and the floral tissues are kind of being pushed off and dropped away from the fruit. So you can see as we're probably just right in the shuck split area here in Grand Junction, and you can see temperatures of 28 can result in a 10% kill, and temperatures of 25 could result in a 90-degree kill. So we have, a very small threshold of frost tolerance as fruit starts developing and or floral tissues come out. So as a little bud, they're much more protected and tight, more resilient to colder temperatures. But as those tissues develop and the flowers are pollinated, they become a little bit more sensitive. So this last weekend, we had temperatures in the 30s. So it was really close. Some of our growers were running their frost protection mechanisms for sure to make sure that they could um, save as much fruit as possible. The same thing is true for apple. We have very similar charts, and all the temperatures are different based on developmental stage. Again, we have the same also for cherry. So again, you can see the differences in the bud evolution and stages, but still the temperatures kind of when you're coming at that post bloom um, window, you're still looking at temperatures just below freezing. So our growers are really concerned, and if you have backyard fruit production, you should also be quite concerned with these temperatures that are hovering just around freezing at either first bloom, full bloom, or post bloom. So when it comes to frost protection, what do we really have, and how is this being? Um, what are the tools that the growers have to kind of mitigate some of this? Well, typically, I have a picture of sprinkler and overhead irrigation. This year was one of the rare years where growers actually had access to irrigation water um, during kind of this period. However, most of our growers aren't set up to water the canopy in a way that would cover the floral tissues. And you can see in those pictures the creation of a lot of ice. And this is a thermodynamic property to where the water will freeze on the floral tissue, and when it's freezing, it's actually releasing heat, so it can um, protect the bloom underneath the ice. And the key to this method is to continue watering until all the ice has melted. So you need to continue watering throughout the day until it's all melted, or that reverse property of melting the ice in thermodynamics can actually release some cold and still zap you. What so I said that's not a real great tool for our growers. What is pretty effective and what most growers rely on are wind machines. And this tool can be used when there is the inversion that I was talking about. So you have the cold air kind of settling, and these towers are several feet up in the air, 30 to 50 feet. And essentially what happens is that warm air at the top where that propeller is much warmer than the fruit, the temperature on the ground or the surface. So they'll turn on these giant propellers in order to stir up the air. So they're trying to flip the layers or just mix them. So instead of having cold on the bottom, warm on the top, they turn it on to spin that air and hopefully get some mitigation for the frost. There's also propane heaters that some people have in their orchards. Sometimes they're using combination with wind machines. Um, Not everybody has them. Some people think they work. Some people don't think they're as effective. So what can you do in your backyard if you just have several trees? Well, you can see this picture on the bottom right. Someone has a barbecue grill in and underneath like a homemade little high tunnel shelter. Um, I'm not sure how well that would work, but you could definitely try it. I'm not advocating for that method. It seems a little dangerous to be under there. But there are other things that we can do. And this kind of gets back to a real simple principle. Depending on how big your orchard or your tree fruit section or where you want to, how many trees you want to have, uh, choosing the age old principle of right plant, right place is going to be really, really helpful when it comes to tree fruit production. So putting it against a stone wall or the side of your house or in your courtyard. In the past, people used to use Christmas lights to warm up the trees. The incandescent bulbs produce a lot of heat. Those can be a lot more challenging to find nowadays, but they had been known to work. Wrapping your tree in burlap can help in a lot of different ways. Maybe not the best for fruit production, but for winter kill, it might help. And then a lot of growers, we get a lot of people and homeowners talking about tree fruit production in their backyard using high tunnels or greenhouses. And you can see here people using those structures to prevent cooling and frost damage for sure. Okay, so I'm going to move away from climatic factors and I'm going to talk about the tree components and selection. And this is what I worked on for my PhD, as Allison was referring to as rootstocks, and specifically semi-dwarfing rootstocks for a couple of different reasons. And I'll get to that and going forward here. So just a basic reminder here that the fruit trees are made up of two major components, a rootstock and a scion. And they will all have a graft union kind of somewhere within probably a foot or so of the root ball or root mass there. And so rootstock selection can help you with a lot of different things, and it all kind of depends on where you're at and what kind of site and scenario that you have. So on the East Coast and in California, they're selecting for abiotic resistance like waterlogging, root anchorage, and drought. Believe it or not, quite a few you may have seen in the news last 5 years or so. There's a ton of flooding in California, and the orchards were underwater for a long time. They also get really high winds that can lodge and knock over the fruit trees. And of course, we face drought all the time. In other places like the Southeast, they're looking for biotic resistance, like resistance to nematodes, which is often a form of root rot. So thankfully, in Colorado, we don't really have a whole lot of those issues. But one of the biggest challenges for us is replant disease. So if you had an orchard and you decide that orchard is not productive anymore and you want to rip it out, and you replant the orchard with like put peach trees in where peach trees were, you oftentimes can get replant disease, which results in like a stunted orchard with much smaller trees and a much shorter longevity. So this is a major concern for us, especially in Grand Junction, where we have quite limited land due to topography and or irrigation not restrictions, but climatic, geographic restrictions. So we also have some abiotic resistance that we're looking for. So you can see here, one of our summer interns here was looking at the chlorosis on this peach tree here and rating it for its level of chlorosis. So chlorosis is highly related to our calcareous soils, where we have pretty high pH over here on the western slope. A standard orchard wouldn't be far-fetched to say that it was like average would be like somewhere in the 8.5, somewhere around there. So what that does is tie up a lot of our micronutrients, especially iron. And so we're looking for rootstocks that are resistant to iron deficiency. And you can see here behind the intern that that tree behind her looks totally fine, whereas the one in front of her is quite yellow. We're also looking at vigor. So vigor, tree vigor in general can affect yield. It can affect the light environment, which also has an impact on fruit quality. So our growers are really concerned with those first two, yield and fruit quality. So choosing a tree fruit that has the appropriate vigor can be really, really important. Or excuse me, a rootstock can be really important. So here's kind of an example of what I'm talking about by terms of vigor. So on the left, you kind of have a standard, maybe a little bit semi-dwarfing rootstock of controller 5. And then on the right, you can see Crimps 1, which is a highly dwarfing rootstock, which produces a tree that's about 6 to 8 feet tall, where this controller 5 can uh, 10 to 12 maybe feet tall. But more importantly, it's about filling space, right? So you can see all the space between these trees. These are planted a little bit wider to maximize their ability to grow and show their true shape. But you could see how this would impact our growers by how many trees they'd have to buy per acre to fill a space, which can get into return on investment, overall productivity, and things like that. You can also see in this picture here that, when you have something that is really, really dwarfing and only about 6 feet tall, like the person in the middle of this photo here, and we're talking about one of our biggest challenges being inversion frost and cold temperatures closer to the ground, is having these totally dwarfing trees that are only 6 feet tall could be seen as something that is not a great selection for these growers because if they can move their fruit higher up in the canopy or have taller trees, um, perhaps they're able to save some of their crop higher up in the canopy. This isn't just with peach. I would say that apple rootstocks excuse me, the first to kind of develop some of these size limiting scenarios. And apple is grown in a much different way than peach anymore. We're pretty much on a single leader style tree like these, planted in high density format for production. But you can see here too how these B9 trees are just so tiny in Colorado, whereas these B67s are pretty good size. The wires, if you can see the wires in the picture, are about 2 feet apart. So you can see that the one isn't even making it to 6 feet, and the other one is clearly over that 9 foot threshold. So by choosing the proper rootstock, and I think as a homeowner or a backyard fruit production person, this again it has the same exact principles, right? How much space do you have? What fits in your area? And again, especially when it comes to that site selection, and if you're trying to maybe you don't need to put your apple tree close to your house, but maybe you do need to put your peach tree close to your house, and how many peach trees you can fit in next to the barn or next to the wall. Could be impacted by this rootstock selection. Lastly, of course, when we're talking about the tree fruit composition, what most people care about is the scion. And the scion is basically the variety, right? So in peach, you may not be as familiar with the varieties, but you can see this really nice maturity calendar index from Dave Wilson Nursery. This is based on California ripening areas out of the Fresno area. But you can see how as we progress into the season, growers are changing varieties to fill that window of production across the season. And this, again, might be something that you're very interested in. And you might want an early peach, you might want a mid-season peach, and you might want some late-season peaches. Or maybe you know that you like the late-season peaches and you're really familiar with O. Henry, but maybe instead you would like to try something else that you weren't as familiar with. Obviously, some of these early peaches in Colorado just don't work as well. Sometimes they're blooming a little bit earlier. Um, Early peaches can be really tough because if you limit them in any sort of form or fashion, they can often respond poorly. So poor fruit size, poor fruit taste, and poor fruit quality. So in Colorado, our industry kind of revolves around two varieties, Red Haven and Crest Haven. There are varieties before that, and there are varieties between that, and there are varieties after that. But these are kind of the two key um, not threshold, but indicator kind of varieties that growers can kind of use to have the window before Red Haven and Crest Haven. Crest Haven has also been known to be called the kind of in the black peach. So it takes a lot of varieties to get to the Crest Haven, and hopefully, if they can make it really strong crop across the varieties to Crest Haven, that hopefully the remaining varieties after that could be some of the profits for the growers. And again, this means that we're looking at all different fruits, shapes, sizes, colors. These are all different peaches and nectarines. You got flat ones, you got white ones, you got more red fleshed ones. Uh, with pubescence, without pubescence, as in your nectarines, stuff like that. And those will all be differences in your scion characteristics. I probably should have started with apple, but because most people are familiar with apple scions because they're the cultivars. So, and apples are actually sold by cultivars in the store. So you might see or be familiar with all these different cultivars or varieties, which would be the selection you make when ordering your trees. Something that might be of more interest rather than some of those stereotypical varieties you can buy in the store is the Colorado orange, which was a really cool story. If you haven't heard of the Colorado orange, it was a variety that was thought to have come here around the 1800s and then thought lost. And a group from Colorado spent a lot of time trying to find it and genetic testing. There's some really cool stories in the Colorado Sun and other sources that talk about finding the Colorado orange. Okay, so let's move on to fruit quality because this I think is probably the one of the things that everybody's after, right? Everybody wants delicious fruit. So what are we talking about when we're doing tree fruit production? Basically, we're harvesting the sun, right? So we are just looking to turn uh, sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into sugars, right? So we are just farming the sun to make sugar. So how do we do that? Well, we don't do much. The trees do it all for us. So just kind of the general idea again of how we're making fruit is that we need to maximize our solar potential, right? So it's really important, and I think this is the biggest challenge that we'll talk about when we get to pruning and thinning is that a lot of backyard people kind of miss this whole part of how this concept is put into play. I think most people understand photosynthesis and that you're making sugars, and the sugars are translocated into the fruit, which makes good quality fruit. However, I think the balance between how much sugar is needed to be made and how much sugar can be made per the amount of fruit you have is something that is often missed. So we will talk about that going forward in a bit. So I think it's really really important to focus on these decisions making that uh, change this source to sink relationship. Source being the sun, sink being the fruit, or the source being the sugars as well. Okay, so this skin, I'm going to go back to commercial production really quick. But if you grew up on a fruit tree farm or in an area that had fruit trees, you may have seen these kind of upper left trees, which what we would call three-dimensional. So one of the pruning systems or styles was often called open vase. And that was just the way everything was done. These trees were larger. There weren't as many dwarfing rootstocks available or semi-dwarfing rootstocks available. So the plant spacing either between trees or between the rows was quite large to allow adequate space for these trees to spread out. However, as tree fruit production kind of goes forward, we're moving more towards this two-dimensional product. And that is basically what growers are calling planar systems. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of benefits to going in this planar system, some of which, again, as we talked about with backyard production, could also come into play with your system in your backyard. So essentially, what it comes down to is that small trees are more efficient. You can see here on the left with this 25% shaded area, basically, you're not going to be producing any fruiting wood in that heavily shaded area. So the black and the gray on these little images or cartoons are areas that you don't really want a lot of on your when you're trying to make fruit. You're really trying to maximize your sunlight so you can maximize your sugar potential and or your fruit quality. And this kind of means that you need to balance the tree in different ways. But it also moves your fruit closer to the main permanent structure. So there's a lot of less moving around by your workers, and it's a little bit more efficient. So you can see how uh, a more three-dimensional canopy would be much more challenging to get good coverage of chemicals or fertilizer sprays. So this mechanization really increases efficiency both in labor, pesticide use, and or fertilizer use. But it also goes into mechanization as well. So in the past, a lot of the growers were using ladders and moving the ladders through the orchard. And essentially, what that means is that it's you're paying somebody to haul and move a ladder and not necessarily pick fruit. You're also doing the same with pruning and thinning as well. So the more planar these two-dimensional these systems become, the more efficient they are. And I would argue for backyard and fruit production that some of these systems may be okay for you, especially, like I said, if you have a limited space or area and you're trying to maximize the amount of fruit or trees that you can put in a small area, putting it on this like planar system or mechanized kind of two-dimensional structure could be really, really good. Okay, so let's move on to the most fun part. And this is the part that I love because the manipulation that you can do through pruning and thinning to make that fruit quality is great. And it's really, really fun. And I think it's the applied horticulture at its finest. And it's something that we still use a lot of the principles of good horticultural practices. However, we kind of violate some of them too. So obviously, pruning is the act of cutting and removing the shoots or branches, and training is kind of developing the structure that you want, right? So we're going to use pruning to develop a training system, and you can see there are a lot of different cuts and proper cuts to create kind of what you want going forward. And this can get a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to help walk you through it here because I think uh, training is something that a lot of growers get wrong, or fruit tree producers get wrong. So figuring out how the tree is going to respond, what it's going to do when you make a cut is really, really important and also really fun. Um, this is where you can do something to the tree, actual manipulation, and see if you've done it right or wrong. See if what you thought was going to be the response was actually the response. And so it can be really fun, especially in with fruit. Okay, so this gets a little wordy, but I broke it down in the next slide, so hopefully you can kind of um, see it through both pictures. But basically, what we're kind of looking at is apical control and correlative inhibition, right? And so when you have a young tree, you're going to have a lot of correlative inhibition. So basically what that is the apical dominance of the tip of the shoot growing out and extending, and you're not really getting a lot of development behind that apical bud, the tip of the shoot. So it will oftentimes, like in this little cartoon on the right, the first year you don't get much. You just get an elongation of that bud or shoot tip. Um, However, in the second year, you start to have shoot development. And you can see that as that uh, first year growth continues out from your bud tip, in the second year, you start to develop other branches on the side. And the point with this is that as you move further away down towards the trunk of the tree, your branch angle is going to become much wider and flatter. And this is the tree's way of just maximizing sun availability for itself. So you can imagine that if the tree branches are kind of steep angle closer to the tip of the shoot and going out as you go down the shoot, it just opens up more opportunities for sun capture further down the shoot with the flatter branch angles. Okay, so let's try to look at this again with a little bit better drawing than that cartoon there. So you can see we're going to be talking about the apex or the terminal bud. And these bud scale scars can show you the differences between years. So if you start at the bottom of this picture and you see the bud scale scar, that would typically be, yeah. Okay, so if you go from that bud scale scar to the next bud scale scar, that would be your 2nd-year-old wood, right? Because you're working your way from the tip down to the first one. That will be your 1st-year growth. Then down below that will be your 2nd-year growth. So, but you can see that 1st-year growth from the tip to the first bud scale scar, you don't really see a lot of shoot development, and that is the correlative inhibition. So if you remove that terminal bud, it removes that inhibition, and you can produce lateral shoots on the 1st-year wood. If you don't do that, they will develop on the 2nd-year wood behind your apex or the tip of your shoot. And again, you can see that they will primarily be steeper angle as you are closer to the tip, and you go further away from the tip, they get flatter. Also, if you remove that tip, the first 2 branches or so below that removal, so we're moving the apical dominance, we're removing the terminal bud area, you'll see that the first couple shoots will move to replace what has been taken out. So those shoots will work for apical dominance, while the others will again will be flatter and lower angle the further you get away from the cut. So this brings up another kind of really important training concept here is reiteration. And so reiteration is the tendency for a tree to replace any part of the vegetation that is lost through pruning, or sometimes we use breaking. So how and why do we really care about these 2 concepts? Well, we can use heavy topping or pruning to create reiterative growth to kind of set our structure for our training system. So we talked about a little very briefly about training systems, and I'm going to move into that really quickly. But you can imagine that most of our growers will get their trees and they will make a heading cut, and that heading cut will force the tree into this reiterative process to where it wants to regrow what has been removed. This can also create problems to where if you don't prune your tree and you allow it to get way oversized, then you can oftentimes, if you decide to prune it, you'll have a lot of reiterative growth, which will be all water sprouts. And so you can see these trees all over town and Grand Junction where something hasn't been pruned for a long time. And then they prune it, and what you see is a bunch of just broomsticks basically going straight up into the air. And what we would like to do as an orchardist is remember this principle, because it's very helpful when we're establishing a training system, because we want that reiterative growth to be really strong to set our training system and our structure. But after that, we want to really try to eliminate the reiterative growth and spread out the production to be fruiting wood instead of these giant replacement shoots. So here again is kind of some of the systems. So you can see on this tree on the left, we did a pruning heading cut, like at the top of, basically we do that at waist height. And you can see that that pruning cut allowed us to establish these 4 scaffolds in this quad V system here. And now what we're trying to do once we have that structure established is eliminate the idea of that reiteration. So we're trying to have the tree grow fruiting shoots instead of these large water sprouts. So we're trying not to make these massive cuts if we don't have to, but allowing the tree to grow in a way that is productive for us. And on the right, you can see this method too. It works the opposite way in cherry. So we know that cherry grows highly upright and straight. So we are actually planting trees on a 45-degree angle, allowing their tendencies to want to grow upright to produce these fruiting offshoots that are growing literally vertical and spaced in a way that we like them to be spaced to maximize production. So again, we know how the tree wants to grow. We can use the reiterative process to set the structure or the training system. And then after that, we want to kind of minimize or shift the growing system into producing fruiting shoots or fruiting buds, and not always producing these water sprouts or reiterative growth. So you can see here again, it's kind of the same thing, is that on the left, you can see before pruning, we have a general nice structure. And then after pruning on the right, we can see that we primarily just left a lot of those fruiting shoots that we've created through proper pruning techniques. So when we're trying to apply some of the concepts, it just depends on what kind of fruiting system that you're going for. So in this case, you can see on the very bottom the picture of what we call perpendicular V. So these only have two scaffolds, and we're trying to make that heading cut, allowing the reiterative growth to set our structure in the first year. And in the second year, we're removing some of the stuff that's not helpful for us in our structure creation, and using that to create this kind of training system, this perpendicular V that we have here, and then allowing the tree to kind of go back into its normal stasis and produce fruiting shoots and not rely so much on that reiterative growth. Okay, I'm going to move into some of the bearing habits here of apple. And this is important to know as we're going forward and looking at that thinning kind of process. So apple, we have mixed buds, which means we have leaf tissue and floral tissues in the bud together. And we're primarily looking at having these spurs, and spurs are produced on 2-year-old shoots, right? And so we really want to prune in a way that we are producing these 2-year-old shoots. And of course, the flower buds are made up of several different blossoms together. The first of which is called, the first bloom to open is often called the king bloom, and they open in sequence around. And the king bloom is important to know because that is the fruit that we really want to keep. It's the strongest one, and we want to remove the rest when we're thinning to produce good style fruit. So with apple training systems, there's still people for backyards will use open vase, but this can take a lot of space. But then we also have these single leaders where we're training the tree up into a very planar, very narrow canopies and planting them very, very close together. And again, it's all kind of based on what you have or what you have space for. A lot of the apple trees in Colorado have been the old farms and ranches have these open vase styles, which can still be quite productive over time. But the new kind of production system, or if you're limited on space, we can use these other training systems, the single leader training systems. And of course here, in different places where you're not really known for fruit, and apple is a kind of an exception, it does really well across the state in most years. But you can utilize these different training principles and practices to create benefits for you when it comes to these cold situations. So this espalier training system can be used against thermal masses to really improve floral bud hardiness in the spring, and or reduce some of this winter kill damage that I talked about earlier. So again, really fun. You can do some really fun stuff with pruning and training structures. You just kind of have to know where you want to go and how to get there. Sweet cherry is a little bit different. So sweet cherry, we're going to have flower buds on the bottom part of 1-year-old shoots, but then we're also going to have 2-year-old spurs. So maximizing both of those and understanding the principles on how those are formed through tipping and spur production, or you want to keep the 1-year-old laterals and base your fruit production off of the base of the 1-year-old shoots, as again, kind of a choice that you're making when you're selecting your training system. And cherry has gone through a lot of different iterations of really interesting, in my mind, training. Like I said, cherry likes to grow straight up and down. So you can do some of these really crazy vertical fruiting walls like this UFO or the bi UFO. It also lends itself really well to this single axis planted at a really high density, or this KGB style, which is kind of like a bush shrub type. And you've seen this picture already before. I talked about this UFO system where we're planting it on an angle and kind of creating these really weird fruiting walls. But this is relying on 2-year-old development of spurs on these upright shoots and making that really nice planar wall to maximize sun potential and also increase accessibility for the pickers. And then this KGB is another fun one too, where you're doing a lot of cuts early, you're relying on that radiative growth to produce these upright shoots. And then those shoots become very similar to like the UFO, where they are all second-year wood, producing spurs and a lot of fruiting shoots for you. I'm going to skip this for now and talk about peach. So peach is the fruit that is born on 1-year-old shoots, right? So it's really, really important that we're forcing the tree through pruning to produce 1-year-old shoots. And we have flower buds that are subtending the vegetative bud. So on each side of the vegetative bud, there's usually a flower bud. And so you can see how that opens up with the solitary flower buds on each side and the vegetative bud in the middle. And again, it's really important. These are 1-year-old shoots. Peach training systems, there aren't quite as many, but you can do a lot of different training systems. I talked about the open vase being that really wide, kind of 12-foot spacing down to a single leader tree. But I would say that for production's sake, most people are using this quad V that has 4 scaffolds, or the perpendicular V or CAC V, which is 2 scaffolds. The nice thing about these different training systems is, and another thing to remember, depending on what kind of rootstock you have, if you have like an average vigor rootstock, the more scaffolds you put on the tree, the more it disperses your vigor. So the response to the cutting will be less. So the radiative growth is a lot less the more scaffolds you have. So in that case, it also will bring down and augment your vigor. So, if you decided to do a 6 scaffold or a hex V, the vigor is separated throughout the tree, much more evenly balanced, and you'll have a lot less tendency for the tree to produce a lot of water sprouts, which I think is one of the things that get home owners and backyard fruit production people in trouble. Is way too much vigorous growth that's not maintained. So spreading out the vigor by having more scaffolds is really, really important. So here you can see we're trying to do some interesting things with peaches too, kind of doing the inline with the 4 or inline quad with 4 uprights in that planar system, perpendicular V, or you can do an inline V as well, which is a linear system. But most people around Orchard Mesa are using this quad V. So why have I spent so much time talking about all this stuff on training? Well, essentially it comes back to fruit size and fruit quality. So ideally, hopefully, if you are wanting to grow tree fruit, the number one thing that you're shooting for is good fruit. That's what everybody wants. So by training and thinning, you can really have a huge impact on what kind of fruit you're going to have. And this is a simple chart that kind of shows that. So first I'll start by looking at the top table. And you can see that we go from unthinned to spacing between the fruit at 12 inches. And we have found that 6-inch spacing maximizes not only the fruit size and yield, but also return bloom. So you don't want to have too much fruit ever, or it can really jeopardize the fruit for next year. And I think that's a really common problem with apple. People forget to thin. and then they lose their fruit and it becomes biennial bearing. So the more thinning you do, the better off you will be. But the recommendation for peach would be 6 inches. And this also has inclination or repercussions, excuse me, on fruit quality. So if the dry matter content, DMC, or soluble solid concentration are both related to taste and quality in relationship to sugar and dry matter formation. So you can see as you go from unthinned to that 12-inch spacing that your dry matter content or your amount of sugars increases. And that is going to relate in a better tasting and higher quality experience for you as an eater. And it's also going to, if you combine the two, you're going to have big fruit that tastes good. So it's really, really important to understand that concept of thinning and its importance on fruit size and or taste. Okay, so moving on to common issues here. So one of the things that is our biggest challenge in Grand Junction is backyard fruit production, and the fact that a lot of people don't take care of their trees. And we have an active industry here in Grand Junction, and it's very important to control for insects because you don't want to be the person that's harboring all the insects and creating basically the nest that goes out and infects everybody else's trees. So I just talked about one of the common problems in apples is being biennial bearing. So if you're not getting apples every year, it's due to poor crop load management. So you need to thin. And with apples, we recommend thinning everything but the king bloom. And there are different thinning practices. You can do it by hand, you can do it with chemicals, but you should really only have one apple per cluster. And then the number two is coddling moth. Coddling moth are what creates worms in your apples. Nobody wants the wormy apples. There's a lot of different insecticides, trunk banding that you can do to prevent these insects from getting into your fruit. You can also bag your fruit. It's something that a lot of people don't realize, but it's a moth laying an egg on your fruit. And you can put something that prohibits that moth from getting into the fruit or laying its egg and prevent that worm from getting inside the apple. So with peach, we have green peach aphid early in the season, which oftentimes relates to over-fertilization, or it can mean that you did poor chemical controls in the fall and or spring, so before bud break. Horticultural oils were great on green peach aphid. Also, so do ladybugs. However, they can blow up to the point to where they can defoliate your trees early in the season. Most of the time, the trees will refoliate, but it can be a huge setback as far as production goes with a large amount of stress on the trees. And then there are crown and twig borers. So there are pheromone disruptions, trapping, and insecticides for both of these. Most of the time, I'm guessing if you are a backyard orchardist, your acreage is not going to be enough to really rely on pheromone disruption, but the trapping and insecticides can work really, really well. And then in cherry, we see like a lot of black cherry aphids. These can be alarming because they can take over an entire branch, but they're really easy to remove. They don't move around as much as green peach aphid. So oftentimes if you see these nasty curling branches and you turn over the leaves and there's a bunch of black aphids in there, just prune it out and bag it and throw it away. Most of the time they don't come back. And then we have the western cherry fruit fly, which you can bait and trap, but that will also put worms in your cherries. I think another problem, like I said, on the western slope, probably our biggest problem, our biggest challenge is nutrition. So understanding the proper nutrition to maximize your fruit and shoot production. Fruit trees don't need a lot, but they do need micronutrients. And like I talked about earlier, we did some studies on calcareous soils of the western slope, and we are seeing that certain rootstocks and scions are impacted by high pH soils, which limits specifically iron, magnesium, and manganese. Sometimes boron can be a problem as well. So understanding your nutrition program is really, really a good thing to know and what you're applying, and especially looking at those micronutrients. Another problem can be over and under watering. You can really limit your fruit size through underwatering, which also limits shoot production. And it can, if you underwater going into the winter, you can suffer more winter damage across the winter season. But overall, I think for backyard, my biggest thing that I see is lack of maintenance. So that can cover all the issues that I just announced before, or it can also translate through pruning and thinning. So the less pruning you do, the poorer fruit production you're going to have. You're going to probably have overproduction, or you might, like I said, go into that biennial production. Um, and or the less thinning you do can also create the same problem. So um, keep up on your maintenance. There are also a lot of diseases like fire blight, scab, and cedar apple rust in apple. In peach, we're mainly fighting gomosis caused by cytospora, which you can see kind of in that middle um, photo. It's a real problem for our growers here on the western slope. It can really lower the productivity in the orchard, and is probably the number one reason that growers replant their orchard is due to loss of productivity through cytospora. And then we have cherry, which usually not too many things going on. There are some insects like I talked about, but we can get bacterial canker in our trees. So if you see a lot of gomosis and weeping coming from the bark, these kind of gummy spots in the tissue, it might be worth checking it for bacterial canker. Lastly, I'll talk about some resources. So one of the best is the Principles of Fruit Crop Management, which is an online CSU course, HORT 453. And again, this is with Dr. Yanis Minas, my mentor, which talks a lot about tree fruit production, mainly through these pre-harvest methods. It goes into a lot more depth than I had time for today, but it's a great class and it is online. One of the things that maybe someone would talk about in the chat is I say it's a resource because a lot of backyard fruit growers don't have the opportunity to or space to grow a lot of fruit. But certain fruits you can graft onto the same rootstock or even scion. So there's a lot of work, not work, but there's a lot of cool experiments that are being done on different fruits together. So the stone fruits can often be grafted together. The palm fruits and citrus trees can also be combined into one. So if you're limited on space, you might want to look into these. I would say that it takes a really good horticulturist to manage these, because typically one of these will really take off and outgrow the others and kind of either force it to be non-existent or cause it to break or something like that. So it does take a keen eye and really good management practices to make it work. Some other resources that you might find helpful just for this area in general, the Intermountain Tree Fruit Guide, which is produced by Colorado State University, Utah State University, Idaho State, and Idaho University. And then if you're really looking into other things and CSU doesn't have the stuff, Utah State has a lot of great fact sheets. And then our big fruit producing areas across the country, like UC Davis, Michigan State, Washington State, Penn State, Cornell are some really good resources. And then books, the Holistic Orchard is a really good one. And locally, we have the Montezuma Restoration Project, the Orchard Restoration Project. They have really cool stuff with rare varieties, like I was talking about with the Colorado Orange, and they will graft interesting varieties onto trees. As well will the Colorado Edible Forest is out of Carbondale, and they are doing a lot of nursery and tree fruit grafting and consulting. And with that, I was over time. Sorry, Allison and everybody. I tried to go a little bit faster, but I didn't quite make it. So if there are any questions, I can stick around for a few minutes and we can chat about that. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. We do have a couple questions. And for those of you who need to leave, we absolutely understand. We'll record this end part so you can come back and watch the last few minutes. So we had a couple questions, Jeff, about your crystal ball prediction of how the early season and maybe early blooms will not only affect production, but also pollination and overall fruit production this year.
Yeah, so well, I guess right now what I would say is everybody is still in the wait and see, and that goes for Grand Junction as well. When I started the talk, I was talking about how we had a killing frost all the way through Mother's Day here. So, being that it's early April still and fruit are actively growing, like we're way past bloom here. So, um, people are nervous, and I don't think that they're quite ready to say that we're out of the woods yet. As far as pollination goes, I haven't seen any problems. The bees are very active, and the fruit set is good. So I think that going forward, there's still the potential for frost. And then over here on the Western Slope and across the state, I think drought and availability of water is going to be a big challenge for our growers and our homeowners. It's going to be a challenge. I think that most places will probably go into some sort of drought restrictions as far as watering goes. Limiting water on fruit production obviously changes the fruit quality profile. We'll have smaller fruit. We'll have less juicy fruit. There'll be less sugars overall in the fruit, so that might affect both size and taste overall. But it's something that our growers are actively working on. In Grand Junction, we have really good water rights, so hopefully they'll be able to keep their business going.
Thank you. And yes, drought is on everybody's mind. I think we're all a little anxious. There was a question from
Mm.
Bob on sterilizing your pruning tools and what you would recommend if that is needed.
That is a great question. It depends what crop you're pruning. Peach, typically we don't recommend sterilization of pruning tools, but apple we do. And this has changed recently. I don't work a lot in apple, but the rules and ideas and thoughts behind this have changed quite a bit. Most of them in apple are related to fire blight. We used to recommend that you change or you sanitize your tools like sometimes every cut, if not every cut, every tree, if not every tree. They're kind of moving to a more of like an every row kind of principle. Um, but the process has also changed a little bit in the fact that I think that it's some of the alcohols aren't as effective as they used to be on controlling for fire blight spread. Um, So, Bob, I could get you some much better information on that if you want to put your email in the chat, or you want to give me a shout over here in the Tri River area. Um, but that has recently changed. Um, I'm not so familiar with Apple, but most other things you're not really working at spreading. If you do have a lot of fire bright, kind of the other recommendation is really, if you can, to try to prune um, at least 12 to 15 inches away from the infected site of the pruning wound, which when that gets into scaffolding tissue or tissue in the trunk, that can become problematic. But we really don't recommend right now, at least, any sort of cleaning of your pruning tools with regards to cytospora and peach, or even in cherry or apple, which can be in all, cytospora can be in all three. So
And because it's so dry, we might not have high pressure of fire blight, right? So it's usually a cool, wet issue. And so now it's warm and dry. Maybe we'll see changes in our disease pressure this summer. That could be a benefit, although we do need rain. And then one last question
likely.
in true. One last question. In a typical orchard, they might have grass or other cover crops below the trees to prevent weeds and help with
Sure.
soil moisture retention. Would wood mulch or a type of mulch in a homeowner landscape make sense?
Yeah, of course. So this is an interesting one. It kind of comes down to preference, honestly. Um, there are it really runs the gamut. So there are some growers that use nothing, literally nothing, and they'll just allow the weeds to grow. And then right before harvest, they'll go through and mow everything as low as they can, mainly to reduce the interference through, like with harvesting tools, like I was talking about with ladders and things like that. But in the backyard, yeah, mulch is great for a lot of different things, preserving soil moisture, limiting weed production. It just kind of depends what you want around the base of your trees. Some people like to keep the base of the trees clean. There can be issues depending on where you're at with if you have really heavy, dense, like a turf type or native grass next to the base of your trees or mixed with clover that can cause problems and issues with voles, and that would could relate to plastic mulch or like a weed barrier, weed cloth, voles living underneath that and feeding on the trunk tissue right at the edge of the bark, causing some issues. But yes, I really like it when use a wood mulch or a living cover crop just for keeping weeds down, for adding some carbon back into the soil, for cooling the soil surface, all different sorts of things. I really like the use of cover crops and our mulch.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff, Dr. Pieper. We appreciate it. That was a load of information that you covered in about an hour. So we thank you for your time, your expertise, and for those of you still on, thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the future. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
See you later. Feel free to reach out.